Hello and welcome to LSAT Logic Applied. I'm your host, Andrew Leahy, an assistant teaching professor of law at Drexel Klein School of Law. This is a short format podcast where I take the tools from LSAT logical reasoning, assumptions, flaws, causation, strength and weaken, and apply them to real-world claims in the news, science, and public discourse. For those that don't know, the LSAT is the law school admission test, a standardized exam designed to assess logical reasoning, analytical thinking, and reading comprehension for law school applicants. It's a high-stakes test with a unique focus on how arguments work and how they fall apart. The LSAT is owned and administered by the Law School Admission Council, or LSAC. I don't claim any affiliation or ownership. I'm just here to teach the logic. You don't need to be studying for the LSAT to follow along. The point is to learn how to spot weak or incomplete reasoning in everyday life, the same kind of reasoning the LSAT trains you to attack under time pressure. Today's episode looks at a claim in environmental science and consumer behavior that most people misunderstand the environmental impact of the food they eat, and that better labeling could fix the problem. We're not evaluating which foods are good or bad for the environment. We're evaluating how the argument about public misunderstanding is constructed. Here's the background. A recent study asked 168 participants in the UK to sort a wide range of common grocery store foods based on their environmental impact. Instead of giving them predefined categories, researchers let participants create their own groupings, essentially revealing how people naturally think about sustainability. The results showed that people tend to rely on two main heuristics. First, whether a food is animal-based or plant-based, and second, how processed it is. Participants generally assume that meat and highly processed foods have higher environmental impacts, but when researchers compared those perceptions to scientific estimates based on life cycle assessments, they found consistent mismatches. People tended to overestimate the impact of processed foods and underestimate the impact of certain water-intensive products like nuts and rice. From this, the study suggests that consumers hold some misconceptions, and that clearer environmental labeling could help correct them and influence behavior. That conclusion has some intuitive appeal. If people are wrong about which foods are harmful, then better information should lead to better choices. But before we accept that, let's apply some LSAT logic, because the key question isn't whether people simplify complex information. The key question is whether this study actually shows that people are wrong in a meaningful way, and whether labeling would fix it. The structure of the argument looks something like this. Consumers categorize foods using simple heuristics, like animal versus plant origin and level of processing. Those perceptions do not always match scientific estimates of environmental impact. Therefore, consumers misunderstand food's environmental impact, and better labeling would improve decision-making. At first glance, that seems relatively straightforward. If people's beliefs don't match the data, then those beliefs must be incorrect. But on the LSAT, this is where we slow down, because the argument depends on several assumptions that are not fully established. First, we have sampling and representativeness problems, potentially. Let's start with the sample. The study is based on 168 participants, all in the UK, completing an online sorting task. But the conclusion is framed much more broadly, suggesting that people in general misunderstand food's environmental impact. On the LSAT, that's a classic issue, a potentially underrepresentative sample being used to support a general claim. One key question is, would consumers in different countries, cultures, or shopping environments think the same way? If not, then the conclusion may be overstated. There's also the question about how realistic the task actually is. Participants weren't shopping. They weren't comparing prices, habits, or preferences. They were sorting products in an abstract exercise. On the LSAT, that raises a concern about external validity. Does behavior in a controlled task reflect real-world decision-making? Even if people categorize foods imperfectly in a lab setting, it doesn't necessarily follow that they make poor choices in actual grocery stores. Now we get to one of the most important issues here with measurement assumption. The study compares participants' perceptions to, quote, scientifically estimated environmental impacts based on life cycle assessments. But even the study acknowledges that there is no single agreed upon way to measure environmental impact or weigh different factors like emissions, land use, and water use. That introduces a hidden assumption that the scientific benchmark being used is the correct or definitive measure. On the LSAT, that is a vulnerability. If the standard itself is contestable, then calling people wrong becomes more complicated. There's also a deeper issue here of heuristics versus errors. Participants relied on simple rules, animal products, and processing level to judge impact. The study treats deviations from scientific estimates as misconceptions, but another interpretation is that people are using heuristics, simplified rules that are often directionally correct, even if not perfectly precise. On the LSAT, this is a subtle but important distinction. Are people actually wrong, or are they simplifying a complex system in a way that is generally useful in the aggregate? Those are not the same thing. Finally, the study suggests that better labeling could improve consumer choices. But what does it actually measure? It measures self-reported intentions, whether participants say they would change their behavior after seeing new information. On the LSAT, that raises a familiar issue. Intentions are not the same as actions, and saying you would buy differently is not the same as actually doing it in a real-world setting with prices, habits, and constraints. If we wanted to strengthen the argument, we would want to know, Whether these findings replicate across larger and more diverse populations, whether real world purchasing behavior, not just intentions, changes in response to environmental labels, whether different measurement methods of environmental impact lead to the same conclusions, and finally, whether consumers using simple heuristics consistently make worse environmental choices overall in the aggregate. On the other hand, the argument would be weakened if we showed different populations show different perception patterns, consumers make reasonably good decisions despite simplified mental models, or labeling has little measurable effect on actual purchasing behavior. In other words, the key issue is not whether perceptions differ from scientific estimates, it's whether that difference actually matters in practice. This episode isn't really about food. It's about how we interpret claims that people are misinformed. On the LSAT, showing a mismatch between belief and data is just the starting point. The real questions are, is the data the right benchmark? Is the sample representative? And does correcting the belief actually change outcomes? People rely on simple models to navigate complex systems all the time, so the presence of simplification doesn't automatically mean misunderstanding. Learning to distinguish between flawed reasoning and practical simplification is exactly the kind of skill the LSAT is designed to test. And with that, I thank you for listening to LSAT Logic Applied. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more short episodes where we apply clean logic to messy real-world claims. See you next time.